freue mich, Ihnen den ersten Impulsredner von heute vorstellen zu dürfen, Professor Piotrowicz. Er ist Professor für Recht an der Universität in Aberystwyth und war Greta-Mitglied viele Jahre, auch Vizepräsident und auch in 2 Amtszeiten Mitglied der Sachverständigengruppe der Europäischen Kommission für Menschenhandel. Und er ist also seit vielen Jahren im Feld und zusätzlich ist er Mitglied der Wales Anti-Slavery Leadership Group und arbeitet derzeit an einer Reihe von Projekten zu rechtlichen Fragen des Menschenhandels. Ryszard ist Mitglied des Boards of Editors des International Journal of Refugee Law. Auch das mal geben Sie ihm einen Applaus, damit er gut auf die Bühne kam, und the floor is yours, Ryszard.
I'm not taking anything else. So. Guten Morgen, sehr geehrte Damen und Herren. Ich freue mich, zum ersten Mal nach 2 Jahren wieder in Deutschland zu sein. Normalerweise bin ich 4 oder 5 Mal im Jahr in Deutschland, besonders in Berlin. Und ich freue mich, nach 20 Monaten wieder im Ausland überhaupt zu sein und in der EU. Ich komme aus Großbritannien. Ne? So. Und das war ziemlich kompliziert, nach Deutschland hinzufahren, aber es hat geschafft. Und jetzt werde ich weiter auf Englisch sprechen. I was given a rather wide mandate to speak about strategies and challenges with regard to human trafficking. And after listening to yesterday's talks, speeches, discussions, I realized I really have nothing original or new to say. My students have been telling me this for many years, so I'm not really surprised. But I do have some observations to make and I've tried to keep to the mandate I was given, but the mandate was rather wide, so please bear with me, and I hope that we will manage to maybe shed a little bit of light on some aspects of this issue of data protection and human trafficking. I don't know if any of you remember the old phone books, you know, 400 or 500 pages with names and addresses and phone numbers. You know, it's before smartphones. But I remember them because this was my first encounter with the need for data protection, because my name is Piotrowicz. I have lived most of my life in the UK and Australia, with shorter periods in Germany and Poland. And in the UK and in Australia, I was always the only Piotrowicz in the phone book. And they always publish your name, your address, your phone number, unless you ask them to take it out. And because I was appearing in mass media in Australia, I started to get abusive phone calls because it was very easy to find my name. And so I had to go to Australian Telecom and say, look, can you please leave my name out? And they did. It's standard. But the fallback, the default position was to include your name and your address. So for me, this was a very crude, primitive, early example of the need for data protection. And of course, getting an abusive phone call is nothing compared to being trafficked. But I think you get the idea. I want to make a few obvious observations. We need data, that's obvious. We need to protect that data, that's obvious as well. We need to achieve both, that's also obvious. The problem is that there are so many different perspectives on how we need the data and how we protect it. And yesterday we heard a lot of it, mostly from one side, but I'm not sure that police officers who are engaged in addressing human trafficking would necessarily agree with everything that they heard. I agreed with a lot of it, but I'm sort of on that team, so that doesn't really count. And Germany is a rather special place in which to talk about privacy, you know. When a big crime takes place in this country, the German mass media, and I try to read a fair bit of German mass media, will identify the suspect by their first name and the first initial of their surname, like Angela M. is gestern verhaftet worden or something like that. And it's all over the internet who it was. You just have to open your laptop and you can find out. But you look in Spiegel or Frankfurt Allgemeine Zeitung or Süddeutsche Zeitung and they won't tell you. So it's a very peculiar or particular or special environment that we work in if we're in Germany. But there are some challenges that I have noticed. Some countries are more relaxed about the availability of private information. And I live in a country where the tabloid press, the equivalent of Bild-Zeitung, is really a force for evil in some cases, in my opinion, the way that they interfere in the privacy of different people. Sometimes also a force for good in exposing hypocrisy. But nevertheless, I think it's a bit rougher than Germany. But when we're dealing with people who have been trafficked, there are very specific vulnerabilities at stake, as you know. We're dealing with people who have been subjected to sometimes pretty severe psychological, physical, and/or sexual abuse, and that needs to be addressed while respecting their privacy. And for me, there are two aspects of that. One is the inherent need to respect privacy without any other justification, without any further practical justification. That should be respected. But the practical one, of course, is that to protect them from possible future violence or exploitation. So there's an in-principle need and another very practical need, which is not always recognised. And I've been in some countries as a member of Greta where state officials are acting in good faith, but they just don't understand what data protection means in the way that it is clearly understood in Germany. And so that future risk is something that's very, very important. We need to keep their whereabouts confidential, be it in Germany or another country, should they be repatriated there. But we live in a changed world, and let me explain what I mean by that. There used to be another life before COVID-19. We didn't have these. Do any of you know where these, and under which conditions these face masks were produced in China, by the way? I've been thinking about that, how many billions of face masks there are around the world. Most of them come from China, and I just wonder in which conditions they are produced. Anyway, if you know, maybe keep it to yourself. There used to be a world before COVID-19. There was another life before 9/11. I was actually in Frankfurt Oder when 9/11 happened. And another life before the General Data Protection Regulation. The GDPR is a well-intentioned instrument that has struck fear into the hearts of governments, agencies, universities, I know because I work in one, and NGOs around the world, to say the least. In 2019, the issue was even raised in the European Parliament. It was pointed out that the Dutch National Rapporteur on trafficking in human beings and sexual violence against children had stated the organisations which have played a significant role in uncovering THB had become more reluctant to report potential cases because often the individuals concerned had not given their explicit consent. And I think this is a real issue, understanding what you need explicit consent for and what you don't need it for. And at least in the UK, there's a lot of fear about this, there's no doubt about it. And in actual fact, one thing that really irritates me is that often one will be dealing with some agency or organisation and will say in a completely illogical way that they cannot give you this information because of the General Data Protection Regulation, and it clearly has nothing to do with it. It probably happens here in Germany as well. Now, part of the complexity is an issue here. Part of the problem is that, of course, the GDPR is not the only relevant and applicable instrument when it comes to data protection, and this came up yesterday, if I remember correctly. So you need to understand the regulation in its context. Any lawyer would know that. They might not know the law, but they know the need for context. Another issue is that it may not always be clear which provisions of the regulation apply in a particular situation. Now, there's no doubt in my mind that there's a legitimate need to share data, and I don't think anybody in this room would disagree with that. The question is, how far does that legitimate need go, and how should that legitimate need actually be given effect to? Data has to be shared for many proper reasons, amongst many agencies with legitimate interests in having that data, be it shelters, police, prosecutors, immigration authorities, social workers, medical personnel, lawyers, and even people like me sometimes, academics trying to further shed light on the crime. But of course, I don't need all of that data relating to trafficked people. I doubt if I ever need to know the identity of an actual trafficked person to do the kind of work that I do. And I've never sought to obtain that data, and I wouldn't even accept it if it were offered to me, because I don't need it. There's no point. Now, there are two ways in which I can see the collection and use of data as being potentially problematic. The obvious one, of course, is the collection, use and sharing of data relating to the trafficked people themselves. But the other one is on the collection of data on the extent and nature of human trafficking and the types of exploitation that occur, which is the kind of thing that Greta is interested in. I'm not a member of Greta. I can't really quite get it out of my system, so it keeps coming back up. Now, there's obviously an obligation to protect data. And the duty to protect the data of trafficked persons can be found not just in the GDPR, but in general human rights law, although it's specifically recognised and develops in European law in the Council of Europe Convention, which was spoken about yesterday, and in the EU Anti-Trafficking Directive. Now, I'm not going to repeat things that Julia mentioned yesterday, but I just want to remind you of what Article 11 of the Council of Europe Convention says. It says that each party shall protect the private life and identity of victims. Personal data regarding them shall be stored and used in conformity with the conditions provided for by the Convention for the protection of individuals with regard to automatic processing of personal data. It's a very interesting convention that if you have trouble sleeping, just open it and you'll be cured. I did actually look at it once, but it's important. It is important. Now, in that context, the thing to remember is that we talked yesterday very much about the European Union context, which is appropriate for Germany, but of course, that is not all of Europe, even though people talk about Europe as if they mean the European Union, and the GDPR doesn't apply throughout Europe. It applies in the European Union, which leaves a lot of other countries where it does not apply. And people might be being repatriated to those countries from EU countries. And therefore, we need to take that into account when people are being repatriated more or less willingly. Now, there are clear problems on data. I'm just looking at the time. Give me about 5 to 10 more minutes. I think it'll be okay. There are some problems with regard to data collection. It has to be collected and curated so that we can derive the relevant or appropriate insights. And for that, it has to be reliable. That means that the methods that we use must be capable of yielding accurate data. And the issue, as I see it, is that there may be cases where particular agencies or individuals who are involved in dealing with trafficking might receive or somehow obtain information more than they actually need in order to carry out their functions. I've certainly been in that position where, without trying, I've been given information that I shouldn't have got and didn't need. And even if they need the data that they have, they might fail to protect the security of that data. So that can have negative ramifications for the individuals concerned, and I will give you some examples of this shortly. And I want to mention the guide produced in 2015 by KOK, and I think I forgot to thank KOK for the invitation to speak here. I meant to, and so I apologise, but I thank KOK now before I finish and be shown the door rapidly. So in 2015, KOK produced this guide, the Data Protection Challenges in Anti-Trafficking Policies, a practical guide. And it made 8 recommendations with regard to the data of trafficked persons at pages 74 to 75. I have read it. And they all make very good sense to me. And if followed, they would do an awful lot to uphold the confidentiality of personal data. But for me, and I know that I know that some people disagree, but maybe I've taken this out of context, but I'm going to say where I disagree with this, and I'll be happy to be corrected. But one of the recommendations, at least to me, might be open to question, which is that any transfer of trafficked persons' personal data across national borders should be avoided. And I'll tell you why I had a problem with that, reading it from my perspective, in the context of repatriation. Now, under Article 16 of the Council of Europe Convention, if a person is being repatriated after being trafficked abroad, there's a duty on the part of the state to take a number of steps to ensure that such repatriation is carried out with due regard to the rights and safety and dignity of that particular individual. And states which are asked to do so, in other words, receiving states or potentially receiving states, are obliged to confirm whether a person is indeed its citizen or permanent resident. And actually, I can give you a good example of this, a tragic example, where this failed. About 15 years ago, about a large number of ethnic Chinese people, I think it was about 60, drowned off the west coast of England. They were picking shellfish on the beach, and the tide came in very rapidly, and they were drowned. Now, these people, they were not officially in the UK. They had certainly been smuggled and probably been trafficked. And the problem for the British authorities was that the Chinese government was extremely uncooperative in helping them to identify these bodies so that they could be repatriated for their families. There was a much more recent case of, which I'm sure you've heard of a similarly large number of Vietnamese people who died in a truck, in a container, which was brought across the English Channel, and all the bodies were found. This is about maybe 1.5 years ago. And every one of them suffocated. And again, part of the problem was getting the cooperation of the Vietnamese authorities to try to find out, to put it bluntly, who these bodies belonged to. So this can be very important for very tragic reasons, but hopefully when the people are still alive, it is even more important that they can be repatriated safely. So the states are obliged to, quote, to adopt, this will be my last quote from the Council of Europe Convention, are obliged to adopt such legislative or other measures as may be necessary to establish repatriation programs involving relevant national or international institutions and NGOs. Now, it's not clear to me at all how you can organise safe and orderly repatriation without communicating with the home country or the receiving country who you're sending back. What is his or her name? Where they might live, because maybe that's where they should not be taken. Information to enable the receiving country to safely and in an orderly way receive that person and hopefully help them to start to reintegrate into that particular country, and obviously not just leave them at the train station or the bus station or wherever it is. Now, in the context of law enforcement and security, and hence migration as things operate mostly in Europe, some processing operations can be carried out, might be carried out in secrecy and without involving the individual whose data are being processed. And this can have adverse impacts for the individual concerned. Now, for me, there's a problem of a lack of consistency in the collection and use of data. I told you I had nothing original to say. You all know that. But let me just explain. When Greta asks for information on the number of people who have been identified as having been trafficked in a particular country during a particular period of time, as I said earlier, it's not asking for names, and it shouldn't be. It's trying to assess the prevalence of THB to get as good, as comprehensive and clear and accurate a picture as possible about what is going on in the particular countries. And the problem is that different countries do it in different ways. And this adds sometimes days, if not months of work for data scientists who are trying to make sense of that data so that it can tell us something useful. And I'm not a data scientist, but I've looked at some of these data from country A or country B, and sometimes it doesn't make any sense at all without follow-up questions, and sometimes the answer that comes back makes it even worse than it was before. And I'm led to the conclusion that actually they're trying to conceal more than they reveal with these figures. I might be wrong, but I'm sure that sometimes they're acting in bad faith. I can't prove it. Anyway, most countries cannot tell you very much about the trafficker beyond their age or gender or identity, or age or gender or nationality, and that could be useful information. But there's a big inconsistency about information as to the types of exploitation that occurred, how many people were men, how many were women, how many children, and so on. And you get the idea. So it makes it very, very difficult, and I think this was made clear yesterday. And this is despite the fact that often one can actually obtain reliable data if one knows the right sources and can get access. And I'm not talking about secret sources either, I'm talking about open sources. And as an academic, I can say that I can only dream of getting access to some of that stuff sometimes. And I have actually, I'm not making this up, I have been told by one particular government, well, by the embassy of one particular government, and that government is located here in Berlin, the embassy was in Australia, that they didn't have a particular document I was looking for because I had been lost in the floods. They actually told me that. And I thought this only happened in comedies. I was given that in writing. They didn't have it. So documents can get lost in the floods, or the dog can eat your homework, or the modern version is the cat jumps on the keyboard. Yeah, that's except my cat has actually jumped on my keyboard. Now, I'm getting to the end. Another problem is that the full extent of trafficking can be hidden because some countries talk about the number of cases of trafficking they've had. Now, when they talk about cases, do they mean one prosecution was 10 trafficked people? You understand what I'm getting at here. They're never really specific. It's like when they talk about legal aid, what do they mean by legal aid? Because that's understood differently in different countries. So for me, that's a real problem, getting accurate data. And one of the issues also is getting enough resources to address this, whether that be to support or protect victims or for investigation or prosecution. And some countries, and this is a problem for me, depend upon external funding, and that is often from Brussels or Washington, to pay for the anti-trafficking activities, and that includes the collection of accurate data. And these data are needed to provide as clear a picture as possible of the state of play at any one time. Now, I'm coming towards the end, and I want to talk about some basic failures to protect data. Some countries really have little idea of data protection. I was monitoring one country a few years ago with Greta, and we were visiting a shelter. Now, when I visit a shelter, sometimes we never meet any trafficked person. Sometimes the trafficked person asks to meet us. And I asked advice, because how do I deal with this? And I was told, I was given good advice. You never ask the person about the kind of exploitation that she or he has suffered. You ask them about the conditions in the shelter. You ask them if they get what kind of support they're getting. In other words, how are their dealings with the authorities, that kind of thing. But in this country, we were in a shelter, and they said they had 7 people there, currently resident there, who had been trafficked. And without even asking us, they brought them out like animals on show. And they said that of these 7 people, 6 had been trafficked for labour exploitation and 1 for sexual exploitation. Now, they didn't give us the names of those people. We did not ask for them. But for me, in one way, this was a very deep, clear violation of their privacy and their personal data, in the sense that they were brought out like people on parade for us to see. And I believe this was done out of ignorance rather than bad faith in that particular country. But it was very bad. Now, so I think there's a big need to raise awareness in some countries of the appropriate protection and use of data, even in countries where there might be a high awareness of that already, as well as a need to change attitudes among some of those who have access to the personal data of trafficked people. And I will finish with one example of the problems in even finding, and this is not so much about the data and the numbers, but when I talk about data and information, I'm talking about the problem of identifying people who have been trafficked or who are at risk. And I can name the country, this is not a secret. We were monitoring North Macedonia, or at the time it was called the former Yugoslav Republic of Macedonia, in 2017, so about 4.5 years ago. And we asked them, this is a country of about 2 million people, and there had been significant transit of migrants or asylum seekers trying to get from Greece into the EU proper, as they regarded it, meaning probably Germany or Sweden, or for the severely deluded ones, the United Kingdom. But they were trying to get through Macedonia. And Macedonia wasn't shutting the border. They were aiming for Serbia and then to move on. And we asked them, what did they do during the wave, the 2015 wave? I know that you didn't like this word. I think, Julia, yesterday, I think you said you didn't like the word wave of migration. But anyway, I'm calling it that. I don't mean it in any pejorative way. But this significant amount of migration. And I asked the border guards at a meeting, what did you do in looking for people who maybe were being trafficked or who were at risk, like unaccompanied minors? And they said, look, and they told us what is the size of the number of people they have on the border with Greece. And they said, we were overwhelmed. We tried to get more people, we tried to train them, but we just couldn't do anything. The best that we could do was to put on public transport to take them to the northern border so that they would not be ripped off by people offering private taxis. And I had to have some sympathy for that. This was a tiny country with limited resources, limited trained people, and they were just overwhelmed. And in that situation, when we're talking about data in the context of information and identifying trafficked people, there was little they could do. They did make big efforts to train people up, but that takes time, as you know. Okay, I will finish there. What I've tried to do is just to talk about some issues which I thought were interesting in the context of challenges and strategies. So, ich bedanke mich viel und ich hoffe, dass wir noch weiter darüber diskutieren können.
Ja, ganz herzlichen Dank, Ryszard, für diesen Aufschlag, ja, uns auch so weiter zu sensibilisieren mit Blick auf die Sensitivität der Daten und die fehlende, müssen wir so klar sagen, die fehlende Kohärenz und der gemeinsame normative Grund des Ganzen, ja, im Vergleich der Länder. Und hier schauen wir erstmal, ob es direkte Fragen gibt, die jetzt an Ryszard gestellt werden können. Gibt es Dinge, die noch besser verstanden werden wollen? Kommentare? Genau. Und wieder wird das Mikrofon gebracht. Ja.
Ja. Okay, gerne. Ja, vielen Dank, Richard, für den sehr lebhaften und interessanten Vortrag. Ich hätte mehrere Punkte. Ich beschränke mich jetzt auf einen, den ich noch mal kurz vielleicht auch, wo ich dich fragen möchte, aber eben auch kontrovers diskutieren möchte, ist, und zwar, das ist die Stelle, an der du gesagt hast, dass du nicht damit übereinstimmst, dass personenbezogene Daten von Betroffenen von Menschenhandel über Grenzen transportiert werden sollten. Da ich Co-Autorin des Date Act Buches bin, wollte ich kurz beschreiben, das Szenario, warum wir das mit reingenommen haben. Und daran schließt sich auch die Frage an. Grundsätzlich, es gibt zwei Grundvoraussetzungen. Das eine ist, das Recht auf Privatsphäre wurde Ende des 19. Jahrhunderts von Brandeis und Warren erfunden oder konzeptionalisiert als das Recht, in Ruhe gelassen zu werden, the right to be let alone. Und das war die eine Grundvoraussetzung. Die andere Grundvoraussetzung ist, auch Betroffene von Menschenhandel haben ihre eigene Agency, ihre eigene Handlungsvollmächtigung. Ich weiß gar nicht, wie man das im Deutschen sagt. Sie haben ihre Agency. Wir haben erlebt, dass viele Regierungen in den klassischen Herkunftsländern ganz viele Anti-Trafficking-Programme aufgebaut haben und frustriert waren, weil niemand nach der Rückkehr in diese Shelter wollten, weil die Betroffenen von Menschenhandel, die wollten einfach in Ruhe gelassen werden. Und dann kam immer mehr der Druck auch auf zivilgesellschaftliche Organisationen, die in den Zielländern Betroffene von Menschenhandel beraten haben. Sie sollten doch bitte die Namen der Betroffenen an die Herkunftsländer schicken, damit diese auch in diese Shelter mit überführen können. Und das waren nicht Betroffene von Menschenhandel, die in irgendwelchen Zeuginnenprogrammen waren, die in irgendwelchen Strafprozessen ausgesagt haben, sondern die einfach nur Beratung bekommen haben und auch nicht mit der Polizei zusammenarbeiten wollten. Und deswegen in diesem Vorjustizraum solche Sicherheitsregime zu bauen, in denen dann Betroffene von Menschenhandel und die personenbezogenen Daten an die Herkunftsländer übermittelt wurden, das war sehr problematisch. Und daran haben wir uns gerichtet und das ist eben in solchen Instrumenten wie Transnational Reform Mechanisms und so ganz genau beschrieben und das ist ein großes Problem, widerspricht auch, da hast du recht, die EU-Datenschutzgrundverordnung gilt nur in EU-Ländern, aber wir haben dieses wunderbare Tool der Europaratskonvention 108+, die ist auch sehr stark hat auch sehr starke Datenschutzverpflichtungen für ein größeres Europa. Meine Frage ist, ich verstehe die Verpflichtung von Herkunftsländern, dass sie Betroffene von Menschenhandel schützen müssen, so, dass es in den Herkunftsländern ein niederschwelliges Angebot gibt und dass die Betroffenen dann sich selber entscheiden, ob sie das annehmen oder nicht. Ich verstehe die Verpflichtung von Schutz nicht so, dass es sich an sicherheitspolitische Maßnahmen um Individuen gestrickt werden, die dann zurückgeführt werden. Also das sind zwei verschiedene Konzepte. Im Trafficking geht man oft in das Zweitere. Ich finde aber ein menschenrechtlicher Ansatz ist, dass auch den Menschen, den Individuen selber überlassen werden sollte, ob sie einen Schutz oder eine Counseling-Struktur aufsuchen. Lange Rede, meine Frage.
Danke. Richard.
I entirely agree that it should be the choice of the individual person, and if she or he wants to return to their country and do their own thing, that should be, of course that should be their business. So I don't think we disagree on that. I think maybe we disagree on, or maybe it's just the way it was put in the KOK guide, because I think I would have put it a bit further. There should be scope for orderly or organised repatriation if people want that, and if it's safe. But people should not be compelled to do it in that way. They can, whether they let, they can be compelled to leave the country if they have no right to remain. But of course, it should be their choice. But if a person does agree to this, it could be through IOM, for example, then whatever one thinks about IOM, then there has to be some legitimate and safe way to transfer that information. So I think that, I'm not so sure that we disagree that much, you know, or at all.
Okay. In Ordnung mit der Antwort? Ja? Okay, gut, vielen Dank. Dann gucken wir nochmal, wo weitere Fragen sind. Dort wird eine Hand gehoben, braucht ein Mikro. Da, in der vierten Reihe, bitte.
Hi, my name is Christina Küsse. My question is, what do you think about the duty to notify within the NRM system in the UK? Because that's extensive data in addition to the NRM numbers.
Is it really excessive data?
That's the question as well.
Yeah.
Because I couldn't hardly...
Yeah. I mean, the NRM is under review again in the United Kingdom at the moment, and I don't know if it will stay like that, but my general view is that the UK is not the great leader in addressing what it calls modern slavery, which I prefer to call human trafficking, that it likes to think it is. That said, I think it does do an awful lot compared to some countries in terms of the strength of the civil society. I think it's almost impossible to keep up with the number of different initiatives that are taking place in the UK. But in terms of the actual duty to notify, I think that should be looked at very, very strictly indeed. So I have suspicions about it, but I wouldn't say just now that I think it's absolutely wrong. So I realise that that's kind of sitting on the fence, but that's where I have quite a big fence. Yeah.
Vielen Dank. Hier noch eine Frage, rechte Seite.
Vielen Dank, Dorothea Czarnecki von Eckbert International. Nur eine Frage bezüglich so der weiteren Betrachtung, also wir haben gestern und heute auch relativ eng das Konzept von Menschenhandel diskutiert und noch gar nicht so richtig auch darauf geguckt, wie verlagert sich das eigentlich und verändert sich das auch so in den Online-Bereich, wie sind die Überschneidungen zu Online-Ausbeutung und Menschenhandel, die Verknüpfungen. Aus deiner Erfahrung heraus, wird der Diskurs unterschiedlich geführt, wenn es klassisch offline Real-Life-Trafficking ist, im Vergleich zu Online-Aspekten in der Ausbeutung, wie Datenschutz da gesehen wird, vor allem auch mit Blick auf GDPR?
Well, I was ready with my answer to your question until you actually asked the question at the very end on GDPR, because I'm not sure I have an answer specifically about GDPR. But I immediately started, when you started talking, I very quickly started thinking about the experience of a former colleague of mine in Greta, who is a prosecutor, and they have been prosecuting this online sexual exploitation of children in Asia by, well, in this case, Norwegians, who are streaming this online exploitation, which apparently makes it harder to catch them because there's nothing downloaded. And first of all, the problem there is the exploitation is terrible, but it's not all necessarily trafficking. And and I'm not in any way diminishing the gravity of the exploitation, but is it trafficking? I'm not so sure, unless you say that when this mother, and there have been cases apparently, exploits or allows her child to be exploited, that itself is already some kind of recruitment. And that, I think, still needs to be argued about. But there will be cases where it will clearly fit within the definition of trafficking, but not all of them. So it's very problematic. I'd never heard of this particular type of exploitation until about 4 years ago. And in terms of data protection, I'm really not sure. In the reports that I saw, which involves police doing a raid and arresting people, all the faces of the children and the person accused were obscured. A bit like they do when they're interviewing people in Afghanistan who are hiding from the Taliban. Yeah? So if that's the kind of thing to which you're alluding, I think that's probably acceptable because no identity is being revealed, and I think it's a public service in raising awareness of this extremely nasty, grave crime that is being perpetrated very often by people in wealthy Western countries against very, well, children are vulnerable in anywhere, but here they're particularly vulnerable. I think that's about as much as I could say to that. But from what I have seen, I think that that's okay. In anything I've seen, nobody has been identified.
Right. So thank you.